The dog wouldn't leave the old shed, scratching at the door with its paws and howling as if begging its owner to open it. When Henry finally swung the door open, he saw something in the dim light that made his heart stop. A man lay on the floor, emaciated, pale, barely alive. "Help me!" he wheezed hoarsely. But what happened next was far more terrifying. Old Henry lived in a small, time-worn house on the outskirts of town, where the last glow of the streetlights faded into the endless fields. His possessions were modest: a couple of acres of land, an old tractor that broke down more often than it worked, and his one loyal friend, Buck, a massive dog with thick grayish-red fur and eyes so intelligent they seemed to see more than people could ever understand. Henry had taken Buck in many years ago on a cold winter evening when the dog was just a lost puppy, shivering from exhaustion. The little one was frail, his paws trembled, and his eyes held the fear of a world that had already been too cruel to him. From that day on, they were inseparable. Henry had grown used to Buck following him everywhere, to the yard on his rare trips into town, even to the lake where the old man sometimes sat, simply staring at the water. But in the past few days, something had changed. Every morning, just as the sun began to rise over the hills, Buck would get up and leave without waiting for his owner, heading straight for the old shed at the far end of the yard. He would lie down in front of the entrance, stretching out his paws, and stay there for hours. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, and wouldn't even react when foxes darted by or the occasional car rumbled down the dirt road. Henry tried calling him. "Buck, come on home, buddy. I've got some leftover pork from last night's dinner for you." But the dog didn't budge. A couple of times he only lifted his head, glanced at his owner, and then fixed his eyes back on the door. At first, Henry thought it was just some passing obsession. Maybe there were rats or foxes in the shed and Buck could sense them. But by the third day, when the dog started scratching at the old wooden boards and letting out quiet, mournful whimpers, Henry felt a creeping unease. The shed had been abandoned for years. It had once belonged to his older brother, Thomas, but Thomas had left town over a decade ago and never returned. Since then, the building had fallen into disrepair. The roof was rotting, the walls were cracked, and inside was nothing but old junk. Maybe Buck found some animal bones in there, or maybe there's a snake and he smells it, Henry wondered, rubbing his chin. But something gnawed at him. That evening, even after the sun had set, Buck didn't leave. He sat right in front of the door, panting heavily, scratching at the wood as if trying to tear it apart. Henry stepped out of the house, gripping a flashlight in his hands. The night sky was black as ink, and the only light came from the porch. As he approached, he heard Buck letting out a low, drawn-out howl, not threatening, not angry, but filled with sorrow. "All right, old boy, let's see what's in there," Henry muttered, feeling a cold unease settle in his chest. He fumbled in his jacket pocket for a ring of old keys. It took him a while to find the right one, his fingers trembling slightly, maybe from the night's chill, maybe from something else, something he couldn't quite name. The key slid into the lock with a dry clank. Henry turned it. The door creaked open, and the air inside hit him, a thick, stale stench of dampness and something else. Something rotten. He stepped inside and froze. Henry stepped inside, raising his flashlight higher. The trembling beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the old, dust-covered floor. The wooden planks were cracked, clumps of dirt had gathered in the corners, and cobwebs clung to the walls, quivering in the draft. Everything looked exactly as it had 10 years ago, the last time he had set foot in here. But something was wrong. A deep, unsettling silence filled the space, sending a chill down his spine. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay and dampness. His heartbeat quickened. And then he saw it. At first, his eyes landed on something unnatural on the floor. A pile of filthy rags? No, it was something else. Henry lowered the flashlight. A body. He sucked in a sharp breath, instinctively stepping back. Lying on the floor, swallowed by the shadows near the wall, was a man. His clothes were tattered and stained, as if they hadn't been changed in months. Dark, matted hair stuck to his forehead, slick with sweat and dust. His face was smeared with grime, his skin an unhealthy shade of gray. He was too still, too lifeless. God damn it. A corpse. Henry was about to bolt, to run outside and call the police, when the body twitched. A faint, barely perceptible movement. Then another. And then, the man's eyes opened. Dull, faded, pupils blown wide. They stared at Henry with the wild intensity of a cornered animal. His lips trembled, his parched tongue struggling to moisten his cracked mouth. "Please, help," he rasped, his voice barely more than a dying whisper. Henry recoiled, his back thudding against the wall. A cold sweat prickled at the nape of his neck. His stomach twisted with dread. His fingers curled into fists. Who is he? What the hell is he doing here? How did he even get into my shed? But Buck... The dog wasn't afraid. On the contrary, Buck whimpered softly and stepped forward, pressing his cold nose against the man's dirt-caked hand. He gave it a gentle lick, as if comforting him. Only now, as his mind began to clear, did Henry notice the details. The wrists. Dark, deep bruises, like someone had kept him bound in handcuffs or rope for a long time. In the dim shadows of his elbows, old and fresh cuts stood out, as if he had tried to free himself. And suddenly, Henry's fear was replaced by something else. This man had been held captive, maybe tortured, maybe locked away. And Buck was the only one who had found him, the only one who hadn't left. And now Henry knew. There wasn't a second to lose. Henry burst out of the shed as if the devil himself were chasing him. The night air felt suffocating, thick with tension, but his thoughts raced even faster than his pounding heart. Phone. In my pocket. His hands trembled as he fumbled for it, fingers slipping on the screen as he dialed the sheriff's number. Ringing. Once. Twice. 3 times. "Come on, damn it," he muttered under his breath, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Sheriff's office. This is Deputy Carter." "This is Henry Lawson. There's a man? Jesus Christ. There's a man in my shed. He's barely alive. You need to get here now." His voice shook. He hated that tremor, but fear and confusion crashed over him in relentless waves. "Slow down, Mr. Lawson. Where exactly are you?" Henry sucked in a sharp breath, forcing himself to focus. "Lawson Ranch, South Road out of town. Old dirt track, past the tree line. Just get here, and send medics. He's in bad shape. Stay put. We're on our way." He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his pulse hammering in his ears. Behind him, a weak groan broke the silence. He turned to see the man in the shed trying to move, only to collapse back onto the floor. Buck remained by his side, watching him intently, as if refusing to leave, even now, with help finally on the way. Then, the night was torn apart by flashing red and blue lights. Police cars, an ambulance, officers moving quickly, efficiently. 2 paramedics were already kneeling beside the stranger, carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. "Pulse is weak, severe dehydration, old injuries, no sign of proper treatment," one of them murmured while assessing the man's condition. Henry stood off to the side, struggling to make sense of any of this. Then, Officer Collins approached him. Tall, broad-shouldered, a face lined with experience and hardened by too many bad nights. His voice carried that tight, focused tone of a man accustomed to hearing terrible things. "He says he was kidnapped." Henry's stomach dropped. Held captive in the basement of a house in town, Collins continued. Managed to escape, but he was injured. He made it here. Hid in your shed to avoid being caught by his abductors. The words hit Henry like ice water. What the hell? Someone had been kidnapped? Locked away? And this poor soul had barely made it to his ranch? Fleeing from whoever had done this to him? Henry swallowed hard, a cold rage curling in his gut. But the worst part was still to come. Collins frowned, pressing his radio closer as a message crackled through. Something flickered in his expression. Not surprise. No. Something more like disgust. He slowly turned back to Henry and let out a heavy breath. We just arrested a man who claims that guy belongs to him. Henry's breath caught. What? Says he's his nephew, and that he was just teaching him a lesson. The word struck like a whip, a deep, visceral sting. Teaching him a lesson? A ringing filled Henry's ears. His hands curled into fists before he even realized it. His teeth clenched so tightly his jaw ached. Where is he? His voice was low, rough. Collins studied him carefully, measuring his reaction. In custody. Don't worry, he's already facing charges. Henry closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady himself. But his heart pounded violently, like it was demanding just one thing: justice. The heat had eased a little, and thin clouds stretched lazily across the horizon, veiling the sun. The air carried the faint scent of dry grass and wood smoke. Henry had lit a fire in the backyard to burn the old branches he'd gathered after the storm. He sat on the porch, legs stretched out, rocking gently in his old, time-worn chair. His hands rested on his knees, a pipe smoldering between his fingers, though he hardly noticed it. His gaze was fixed on Buck. The dog lay curled up at his feet, dozing. His breathing was steady, peaceful. Buck was never the kind of dog to look completely at ease. There was always something watchful about him, as if he were guarding a world that could collapse at any moment. But tonight, even he allowed himself to rest. Henry ran a hand over the dog's broad head, feeling the warmth of his coarse fur beneath his fingers. Buck had been right all along. That boy... Andrew. Henry still hadn't fully wrapped his mind around everything that had happened. The boy they'd found in his shed. His name was Andrew. Thin, hollow-eyed, with the empty stare of someone who had lived in fear for far too long. Andrew had told his story slowly, in broken pieces, like each word had to be dragged out through pain. His own uncle had taken him, locked him away for years. No one knew. No one had looked. And when Andrew finally found the strength to escape, when he stumbled through the night, exhausted, clothes torn, desperate to find anyone, he had come across that old abandoned shed. His legs had given out. His mind was slipping. He had collapsed in the shadows, hiding. If it hadn't been for Buck. Henry exhaled and looked at the dog with quiet gratitude. Buck hadn't just found Andrew. He had felt him, his fear, his pain, his despair, and he had refused to leave until his owner opened that door. Now Andrew was safe. His captor was behind bars. Officer Collins had said the man was facing a life sentence. And yet, deep down, Henry couldn't shake the thought. How many more were out there right now? Locked away in some dark basement, behind some bolted door, with no hope, no help. He looked at Buck again. The dog shifted slightly, pressing his nose against Henry's leg. "Good boy," Henry murmured, running his fingers gently through Buck's fur. Buck let out a soft sigh in response and closed his eyes.